Welcome to this Earnscliffe webinar, Emerging from COVID, Reopening Canada. My name is Alan Gregg. I'm one of 38 principals at the Earnscliffe Strategy Group. Those of you who might not be familiar with our firm, we are a public affairs advisory consulting strategy company with specializations in government relations, strategic communications, and public opinion research. As we've all know, that the COVID pandemic is a crisis that hasn't struck uniformly. It's happened at different times. It's had a different impact on the health, economy of different regions in different ways at different times. And even within provinces, stark differences have emerged. In order to review the thinking behind the reopening plans, we brought together a pretty impressive group of Earnscliffians and one particular special guest. Joining me today is Daniel Dalzell. Daniel is a senior consultant in our Vancouver office, incredibly plugged in with the Horgan government. In moving from west to east, Michael Solberg, who is a principal at our partners, New West Public Affairs. He works out of Calgary and is in constant contact with the Kinney government in Alberta, but also surveys the entire of the prairies. From Ontario, former member of the provincial parliament, Rob Leone. If something's happening at Queen's Park, he knows what's going on. Also from Earnscliffe is Marie-Josée Adet, that she's a specialist in the province of Quebec and follows all things happening in that region. Our special guest is Jordy Morgan. He not only brings a perspective from Atlantic Canada, where he lives in Halifax, but also is a vice president for the Canadian Federation of Independent Business and brings a perspective of the small and medium business community to Canada that is absolutely unique. So with those introductions, let's start, because everyone who tunes in to an Earnscliffe webinar is already very plugged in and smart. We probably don't have any need to go chapter and verse through all the details of each of the opening plans. Rather, what I'm interested in starting is the thinking behind the plan in your region or your province, and what makes it unique. What kind of stands out and makes it different? Danielle, let's start with you on the West Coast.
Yeah, well, we have had a really interesting gradual restart that is decisions that are guided by evidence and science. Looking as we move forward, anything that would set that back would be a resurgence of the virus, outbreaks related to some of the closed sectors that are beginning to reopen here. If we had large numbers of community transition that couldn't be traced would be a setback, but we're really doing everything we can here. The government's doing everything we can here to keep that slow, gradual opening happening. Our new case numbers in BC have been relatively low and on the decline. Yesterday we had 16 new cases. The day before it was 7. We're also in a unique position here. We never closed what many other provinces are now reopening. Large portions of the economy continue to operate through the crisis. Construction and resource sectors, garden shops, golf courses, manufacturing were all allowed to stay open with physical distancing and other measures in place. So our restart is a bit different and perhaps a bit less onerous, with not having to bring all of those sectors online because they're already operating. But Dr. Bonnie Henry, our Provincial Health Officer, Health Minister Adrian Dix, and Premier Horgan have been very clear. The number one priority is to hold the line and not lose the ground we've gained. Decisions will be made following that guiding principle as we move forward. So we can keep going as long as we keep that curve flat.
That Dr. Henry was one of the first to say that go outside, that the prospect of getting COVID in the outdoors is, I think, in her view, infinitesimal. Any differences in the social distancing or the physical space requirements or health requirements in businesses in BC?
It's 2 meters. They've encouraged barriers, I think, that we've seen across the country, plexiglass barriers, things like that. But since the beginning, going outside, remaining distanced, keeping with your family unit has been constant and unchanged, really. There's never been a point where people were told to stay inside completely. That is only if you have signs of any illness or you've been confirmed to have the virus, of course, or if you've returned from other countries and are in the mandatory 14-day quarantine. But apart from that, going outside and keeping that part of your life has been very central to the recovery here.
Now, Michael, people on the prairies have been golfing for a week already. I mean, what's happening? Give us an update and give us some insight into the thinking of the three prairie provinces.
Yeah, sure. So, well, today I'm here in Calgary, Alberta. It's an exciting day here in Alberta. It's day one of phase one of the reopening of the Calgary or of the Alberta economy. And I should actually clarify, not the Calgary economy. It was late last night, was decided by the provincial cabinet that Brooks, Alberta, my hometown, and Calgary, Alberta, would be delayed because of the number of cases here. Apparently, the chief medical officer of health was not convinced that the
That's another processing plant in Brooks, eh?
Absolutely. So absolutely. So Brooks is a town of about 14,000 people. There is a prominent meat packing plant there that I'm of course very familiar with, being from there. But it's the source of one of the largest outbreaks, not just in the country, but on the continent. And that has resulted in almost 10% of the entire Brooks population now having tested positive for coronavirus. Calgary, in a similar manner, being an international port, has struggled to keep up with similar sized cities like Edmonton and slowing the rate of the spread of the virus. So it's now been kicked down the road for its reopening plans on May 25th. However, I mean, leading up to this, Alberta was a leader, in fact, a global leader in its preparation for making sure that frontline workers had necessary PPE and ventilators, even to the point where we could be generous. And we've shared some of our resources. However, this has all happened not without controversy. And there is an enormous amount of questions surrounding the Premier's performance here, not necessarily just because of the coronavirus response, but because, no surprise to anyone, Alberta is feeling this more acutely because we're also dealing with a monumental collapse in the price of oil that has really grinded the economy to a halt if coronavirus wasn't already doing it on its own.
The recent Leger poll just had Jason Kenney at the lowest approval rating of any premier in the country.
Right.
So is this driving more controversy around him as well?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that come to play with respect to the Premier's poorer performance. Let's be clear, he's still polling at a net high approval rate, but he hasn't enjoyed the same type of kind of crisis bump that other premiers in the province or in the country have enjoyed. And I think it's a couple of reasons. One, the opposition party here has not really been working with the government in the same way that some opposition parties have in other parts of the country. There remains a pretty embattled and heels dug in approach by former Premier Notley here, which I think has affected some of the discourse, but also because of the other kind of international factors at play here that the Premier is facing, like I said, with that collapse in the price of oil and the Saudi-Russia price war that has completely decimated the petroleum economy here, which is still worth something like 40% of all commodities leaving the province are petroleum and bitumen and the crude oil economy. So, the Premier has a lot on his plate here, and I think even more so than some of his provincial counterparts. And I think that probably has a lot to do with why he hasn't experienced kind of the same bump that someone like Premier Ford has. And even Premier Legault has enormous support, despite having some of the highest cases of coronavirus in the country.
Quit scooping MJ there, Mike. Quit scooping MJ. Quit scooping MJ. Rob, that Doug Ford, Queen's Park today, laid out their plan. They've talked about a framework before, but it was very, very vague. Give me some insight into what's going on in around Cabinet in Queen's Park right now on this issue. You're on mute there, Rob. There we go.
The one thing that Michael said about the meatpacking plant and how it created one of the biggest outbursts, I think informs a lot of the thinking around the Ford government table. And you've seen that the province of Ontario is the first province to close its schools and shut down its economy in a very dramatic way. And I think that's really informing what the Premier is trying to accomplish in terms of not overloading the medical system, making sure that the number of deaths are minimized. And I think what you're seeing out of the province is that they've actually beat their best projections. The best case scenario at the end of April showed that they would have had 3,000 deaths, and they were almost at half of that. So I think there's a lot of feeling around the table that they have been successful in mitigating the worst case scenario and even doing better than the best case scenario. And I think that has grown, the Premier has grown increasingly more confident about trying to get the economy open again. And he's also feeling a lot of peer pressure from his neighboring provinces and jurisdictions across the country in terms of trying to get this restarted. And I think he's still wanting to be cautious. I think his medical advice and his scientists are saying be cautious, but there is a lot of growing desire to get out. And I think what we saw today certainly was more meat around the bones of that framework that they had released 2 weeks ago. And now we're having some more concrete details in terms of what phase one looks like.
Mary Jose, there was a recent headline in one of the English language dailies that said, "What's the hurry, Premier Legault?" Very curious for a lot of people outside the province, that this is the province that's been hit the hardest of any in the country. Yet Legault and the CAC seems to be very aggressive in their reopening strategy. What's the thinking behind this?
Yeah, first, I will not say that this is an aggressive approach, but more a dynamic one. So the decision to move forward is, sure, like any decision, not unanimous in Quebec as in Canada, but it's not a blind approach and not a province's rudderless approach. When the first economic plan was announced by Legault and its economic team at the end of April, the message was, we will be progressive and we will not hesitate to back down on containment. So this strategy is arguable, but still it was the approach that was chosen since the beginning. And this is why they frame a sequence plan with clear dates and said that we won't hesitate to reconfine if the conditions are not there. And that's what happened in Montreal, right? And that with what we learned today, that the school is still postponed until September.
Now, Jordy, that with the exception of some pretty tragic flare-ups in at funerals and in some long-term care facilities, Atlantic Canada seems to have been not spared, but certainly not hit as hard. And some of the provinces were the first out of the gate with reopening plans. What's going on there now?
Well, I can kind of walk you through the four provinces. Prince Edward Island, and I think the best way to articulate their approach to the entire pandemic is that they essentially put the electronic sign on the Confederation Bridge to read "Go away."
They shut it right down. You can't get on the island.
No, you got 2 entry points, and they're not letting people in or out. I mean, you've got groceries coming in and potatoes going out. That's about it. And they've worked very hard. They have a grand total of 27 cases, no deaths, and I think they get a lot of points for a rather aggressive and innovative support program for business during the pandemic as well. And their reopening approach it's cautious and it's steady, but it's being well managed. And New Brunswick is the other province with no recorded deaths. The Education Minister, Dominic Carty, rang the bell pretty early, and Cabinet listened, and New Brunswick got out ahead of this thing. And then Blaine Higgs, he secured the borders quite quickly, and they're not going to be relaxed anytime soon, which some people feel is problematic, but that's a point of debate. But Premier Higgs is a strong supporter of private sector growth and investment, but how can I put this? Their approach is consistent with the Premier's fiscally conservative mindset for small business. They haven't done a lot. They've depended a lot on the feds, but they've approached reopening pretty aggressively, and most sectors are now starting to open up across New Brunswick. Newfoundland and Labrador is a very different story entirely. It was shell-shocked since the beginning. I kind of pictured Dwight Ball standing in front of his window while his coffee goes cold, wondering what happened when all of this started. Newfoundland and Labrador was thawing out from what was essentially a business freezing state of emergency. And then this happened. And then we have Muskrat Falls now that is on hold indefinitely. They did their budget forecast based on $63 per barrel oil. So you could imagine what that's done to the economy. And I was talking with somebody in Newfoundland, and I think you'll appreciate that sometimes their language is colorful over there. And he characterized it by saying basically the arse is over. And Nova Scotia I think has been perhaps the least restrictive. It's more like the BC model of what they did when they decided to shut things down. The Premier, Stephen McNeil, and Chief Medical Officer Robert Strang have been dealing with a spike of new cases that you mentioned off the top there with the long-term care facilities. They've just basically said they're not going to open up until there are at least 2 weeks to 18 days of no or very low new cases in the community. So there's no real date set for reopening there. And as you mentioned, we've had a sort of a dreadful month of tragedies with the largest mass murder in Canadian history, and then the HMCS Fredericton cyclone helicopter crashing, and a few other things. So sometimes it feels like the lockdown's more like a backdrop.
I want to go back to you, Rob, because it's been said that, a crisis transforms leadership. And a lot of us look at Doug Ford and just scratch our head. I mean, his new BFF is Kristen Freeland, the deputy prime minister, that when anti-lockdown protesters are on Queen's Park, he's calling them yahoos. He's praising an NDP BC government's plan as being real prudent. And a guy who's always been open for business is pretty much the most cautious of all of, and the most likely to put health above the economy, at least in terms of his posture. What's happened to him in the last 2 months? You're on mute again, Rob.
I think it also predates the last couple of months. After the last election, when the federal government, the federal Liberals, just lambasted the Ford government over the entire election. I think what happened after that, and the results that came from a minority parliament, with a sovereigntist party raising their profile once again in the province of Quebec, that Doug Ford came out as the national unity guy. And I think that transformation has continued, and this controversy, this pandemic, and the response to the pandemic has actually allowed him an opportunity to further elaborate and further, go down that road of not being the partisan, bully that I think characterized part of his first year in office. So I think this pandemic has actually allowed him to mold and reset and continue that reset that really started after the last federal election. And I think the other thing that I think this pandemic has provided the government is focus. You can't be talking about all these different things that you want to change. You can't create upheaval. You actually have to sit down, roll up your sleeves, and get the job done. I think that focus and that clarity has really sunk in, and it's forced Ford to actually understand how the province works and how the provincial government works, which I think may have been lacking in the first term of his mandate.
I want to get into how our system of federalism affects our ability to open and manage both the economy and this crisis. But first, I mean, Ford had the potential to be the most disruptive force in federal-provincial relations. Do you think that change is going to be permanent? Do you think he looks and says, I'm getting really good feedback by being this cooperative, reasonable, ready to compromise, get along guy, that in fact, federal-provincial relations might actually improve as a consequence of this?
I'm actually kind of laughing when you say that, because in a press conference earlier this week, Ford was asked by a French journalist who offered Premier Ford as Prime Minister Ford, and his response was not yet, emphatically stopped. She said I was Prime Minister, I said not yet. So I think that he's learned certainly that this approach is actually working. It gets to where I think Ford really wants to be, which is someone who responds to the needs of people, and it's allowed him to grow. And I think in terms of trying to be a unifying force, the fact that he has such a cozy relationship with Minister Freeland, I think, has been a story that is going to outlast this pandemic and potentially be that mediating force after October. Everyone thought the Federation was certainly treading on broken glass or thin ice, and to have a strong province in Ontario to be a mediating moderate voice in federal provincial relations, I think would be constructive for the entire country.
And that's the traditional role they played: the Bill Davis, the Leslie Foss, the John Robarts. In BC, Danielle, I mean, by virtually any metric, the province has done a pretty good job of managing the containment of the pandemic, especially compared to the other two big provinces, Ontario and Quebec. In fact, we were talking about 3 or 4 weeks ago saying, BC is going to be the first out the gate in terms of economic reopening, because they're all part of the sectors you pointed out. Sectors have never closed, and they've done a better job on the health side. Yet at the end of the day, BC was one of the last to actually come forward with a plan, and you're only now moving into so-called phase 2. A lot of us look with admiration on your public health officer, Bonnie Henry. I mean, does she know something that the other health officials across Canada don't? She seems to be very confident in her approach, and very much in control, working with Minister Dix and others.
Absolutely. And on the delay, Premier Horgan said they actually were reluctant to announce the restart earlier than necessary because they didn't want people to see it as a signal they could just go back to normal. So I think plans were in place, but the announcement was delayed more than anything for that reason. And I think that's reflective of the entire approach we've seen across the board in BC. The whole government is very careful about their language. They resisted using words like lockdown or shutdown in March. Now they've even resisted using reopening. It's a gradual phased in restart and lifting of restrictions. And they are very careful to say it's not a return to normal, but a new normal. And that was in the beginning of their plan, the restart plan. And so physical distancing will remain, other measures will remain. They're very, very careful about this. There seems to be a clear understanding that effective communication is central to success here. It's been a core part of it. And there's been an impressive execution of that on the part of the government. Daily press conferences with Dr. Bonnie and Minister Dix are what most of my family and friends build their day around and have been for months. Dr. Bonnie's motto of be calm, be kind, be safe, along with images of her, have been printed on mugs and t-shirts. Songs have been written. So, fan accounts have been started. So public support and trust is high. We see this reflected in public opinion research. And I think that's the secret sauce. And I think Dr. Bonnie and the government are hyper aware of that. So I imagine that will continue very carefully as we move forward.
Very interesting you say that. A lot of evidence coming out of Scandinavia says that public trust is absolutely central to getting the pandemic down, because it requires civic engagement and civil obedience as opposed to disobedience. Michael, we're seeing right across the country, density of population, urban centers hit much, much harder than more rural areas. Yet urban centers are our engines of economic growth, and they've got to get back on track. Nowhere is that kind of divide, urban, non-urban, greater than in the prairies. Any talk about ring roading the cities, having separate rules for the cities versus the non-urban areas?
Yeah, so absolutely there is. And you make a fantastic point. Obviously, urban centers are affected more deeply, just because of the obvious, just density of population. They act as trade corridors. They have international airports in some cases. So it's no surprise that urban centers are hit harder. But this is the very reason why there are discussions underway in ensuring that there are different rules for areas that are not hit as hard. Because right now, every day matters, every hour matters. And if an economy can be reopened, even a local small economy can reopen sooner and can do it safely, we need to be having a conversation about that. So I absolutely think that there will be some nuance to the following phases here. Of course, all with the advice of the Chief Medical Officer of Health. But no question, there's no reason why smaller communities should not be able to reopen who's had limited cases, if any, and be kind of carried behind some of the larger cities that are struggling with very unique issues that are not the same in some smaller and rural parts of the province.
I want to get to mobility because, again, I think that the WHO and our own Teresa Tan kind of infamously said that the virus doesn't respect borders, and that banning travel is not the solution. Proven very, very wrong. But what happens to interprovincial trade, intra-provincial mobility as well under that kind of two-pronged strategy. But first, MJ, one of the reasons I think a lot of, again, non-Quebecers looked at the Ghost plan earlier and said, boy, that's really aggressive, was because it included schools. You made
Yeah.
the point in your earlier answers. Not aggressive, it's dynamic that he's prepared
Yeah.
to step back. We hear today he has stepped back in Montreal. But what was the original reaction to that decision within the province? Was it well understood that he was prepared to be flexible, or did people say, whoa, don't do that?
Yeah. First, I'm gonna finish the question before to jump in that one. We have to remind ourselves that the Greater Montreal area is the double population of the rest of it's the half of the province population.
Right.
So those present two different realities, right? So that's in a fact that we tend to forget. But about the school, how it was received, like many big decisions, it was humanly received with a lot of different and normal reactions, I will say. It's an emotive subject, it's scary, and there was a lot of messages that got around. But overall, like populations, the directions, the parents, teachers went ahead and put the decision to put everything in place to welcome the children. And for now, it works. But Montreal, it's not the case. It's closed. Outside, they have the control and it's open. So it's a balanced reaction, I will say.
In Ontario, though, I mean, it's interesting, and I want you to come back on this after I ask this, Rob, MJ, because we've got this announcement. Businesses are starting to reopen in Ontario now with the plan that was announced today, but no daycare, no school. I mean, how do you go to work if you're a parent without daycare in place, educational systems in place? And back to MJ after Rob answers. Was that part of Legault's thinking? That we have to have parental support if we want to have the economy open. The two, in fact, are linked. First, you, Rob.
I don't think it's lost on government that that in order for the economy to fully reopen and for people to be fully participant in that economy, that a solution has to be brought in terms of what we're going to do with our children. And if any parent out there that's listening to this webinar knows full well that in addition to having to deal with their day-to-day responsibilities at work, even if that work is through a Zoom webinar or a Zoom conference call, that they still have to find the time in the day to
get seen your children on more than one occasion in the webinars.
Yes.
In the Zoom conversations, you're dealing with that every day.
Well, exactly, and
as a father, sure.
I don't think it's lost on government. That's true, and one of the things that I saw from Legault's early move to getting the schools open was a recognition that unless we get parents back to work and back in their jobs, and that the economy cannot fully realize its full potential like it was before. And I think that also speaks to the biggest challenge, which is this isn't going to be a short-term thing. This isn't going to be, end of summer and we're going to reopen the entire economy. This is going to be a long, slow progression to coming back to normal, likely when a vaccine or herd immunity is upon us. And I think that that's just a reality. And that's the challenge, is how to manage the expectations of people, both who want to go to work, who want to see their families, who want to play their sports and go to the gym and go to the concerts. We have a question about that, by the way, Alan, I might want to throw out. These are real things that people are concerned about, and the government's trying to protect people while also being judged on its ability to manage the economy. It is a monumental challenge. It's not an easy thing, and I don't think we should gloss over that.
I didn't mention earlier that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. People who are participating in the webinar, happy to entertain questions. Rob will come to that in a second. But first, back to MJ. You want to add to that the whole intersection between work and education in the province?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I hear what Rod say, and this is a fact. Like you have to balance the two.
And Quebec is the most robust childcare program in the country as well, right?
What?
I said Quebec has got the most robust and comprehensive daycare program in the country. So that's more parents using daycare.
Yes, yeah. But for the school, like, it may be a part of the decision at some point, but when they did announce it by the end of April, the plan to reopening the school was for the good of the children, especially those with learning difficulties and a situation of disability. And, you know, like about the youth protection case reported to child welfare have dropped significantly. So those was an ensemble of factors that were considered. But the main reason was, and still is, that the situation is under control in Quebec, outside Montreal.
Right.
Yeah.
Jordy, the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses is pretty much the voice of small and medium businesses in Canada. I know you guys do a tremendous amount of membership research. What are they saying about the pace of opening, the kind of conditions that are being put upon them as part and parcel of being able to be open? What's working for them and what isn't right now?
Well, I think that the key here is that it's not homogeneous across the country, but how people are looking at this. For example, there's a much higher percentage in Alberta who are saying that it's taking too long to reopen, in British Columbia as well. Less so in the Atlantic provinces, and even less so in Ontario a little bit. But I think the challenge here is for the provinces to find the right balance. I know in Atlantic Canada, they feel that they are, but there are, I think, some pretty critical issues here around how businesses are going to reopen, and there's a huge amount of uncertainty about what this is going to look like. Reopening business is about risk mitigation, and this is going to be one of the most important things, I think, that business owners are going to have to understand, and what it means for their business. Not just retail, where you're looking and saying, okay, somebody's coming in the door and we have a spit shield and we have gloves and we have masks and that kind of stuff. There's the entire supply chain, and ensuring that employees are kept safe, that customers are kept safe. And these are extremely complex operational plans in a lot of instances. So some governments have been good in putting those guidelines in place. Others, in some sectors, there's not much guidance at all. And I think that this is where we're seeing a lot of uncertainty and concern coming from small business. And we hope to explore that a little bit more deeply, because all of these sectors are different. All of these regions of the country have different problems. And I think it behooves government to be able to understand that those operational guidelines are going to be critical in terms of helping people understand and getting buy-in, because this is a gigantic exercise in change management by the country and by the small business sector as well.
What about on the program side too? I mean, we've seen about $150 billion spent in subsidies, wage subsidies, liquidity programs, rent stabilization programs. Are any of those not working for your members right now?
Yeah, when we were talking about this, I think we could say there's the good, there's the bad, and there's the ugly. And I think CEWS has been about the best, covers about 75% of eligible payroll, up to about
alphabet soup. We can't follow all the different.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, yeah, we're in a pretty acronym-rich environment. The Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy.
Yes.
That one's been working pretty well, but we've also found that there's been a lot fewer applications than the government expected. They were expecting about 1 million. They've got about 134,000. The Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance, or CECRA, is the one that I would say is probably the most difficult to get our heads wrapped around. You've got, two levels of government, a tenant and a landlord, trying to make a decision. The money should just go to the tenants. And we also have issues around evictions. And if I may say, in Ontario, the eviction framework there probably should have gone out with the hoop skirt and indentured servitude. It is dreadful. Small businesses are not well protected by the Ontario government there. And I think that we should be looking at moratoriums on evictions. The ugly one is the CERB. And it's been very, very popular. I mean, I think we're about 8 million people have now signed up. They were expecting around 4. That's the $2,000 check. Good stopgap measure, but there's going to be a lot of questions, I think, about impact on the labor force and how we're going to be weaning people off the CERB. There is already a shortage of labor in this country that small business owners are faced with. This isn't helping. So the policymakers in Ottawa are going to have to think very long and hard about how they're going to adjust this in the coming months, because it has created, I think, some problems. As well as helping people, it's created some problems.
I don't want this to be a government fan club, but is it safe to say that the government has been very, very open to the input of your organization in tweaking those programs when you get that kind of feedback and input?
Yeah, well, I think we were talking earlier, we've done 9 surveys now. We've had somewhere around 96,000 responses to the survey questions that we've put out. And it's almost been policymaking in real time. I think Melanie Joly, the minister, put it best, saying, look, we're building this plane while we're flying it. So that feedback loop that we've been gathering every week to the government saying, okay, you've brought this program in, this is how it's being received, these are the opinions around it, and then coming up with policy suggestions to them, and we have on most of these programs, and then them coming back, making those adjustments. It's not something we've seen ever. I mean, you know, the lobbying world, and getting a change in policy at the federal level, you know, it can take months, years, decades. I mean, getting a policy change made in a week is a pretty amazing thing. So we've found that data, and as you know the value of data, Alan, and I know you're a fan of it, we found that bringing them good data, good suggestions, and appropriate feedback, they're listening to it and responding, which is refreshing, to say the least.
Danielle, we've talked about Bonnie Henry, and the BC government generally has seemed to be very in control on this whole thing, both in terms of managing the health side and now the opening. The one area they seem to be a little bit more hysterical about is the border. In fact, I mean, BC has been the most vocal in saying, do not lift the restrictions on that border. And we've seen now everything's been moved to June 12th. Again, give us some insight into the thinking of the BC government. Why has this issue been so important to them? And what is the impact of this for mobility up and down the West Coast, which we know is very considerable in terms of both people and goods and trade?
Yes, at the beginning of this, Premier Horgan was calling for the federal government to close the borders to non-essential travel before they did, a couple of weeks, I think. And that was motivated by Washington State. They had an early outbreak there. It resulted in transmission, I think multiple cases here in BC. So that's a big concern. And yesterday he said that BC, Quebec, and Ontario have all clearly told the Prime Minister that they do not want the border to reopen anytime soon. We hear things about, Dr. Bonnie Henry talks about having your own pandemic. Each province has their own pandemic. It's isolated. It's actually not one whole one. And I think that becomes, you can control your own pandemic. But when you have border flows and borders open, you lose that control to a degree. But the supply chains continue, and I would imagine with 2-week quarantine measures in place, labor could start to flow a little bit, specifically in sectors like the film sector. I could see an openness to that, but widespread opening is definitely viewed as too much of a risk here.
What about the rest of the panel? I mean, this is an issue. I mean, we've talked about, removing interprovincial trade barriers forever. We talked about the longest unprotected border in the world, Canada and the United States. Jordy, we mentioned the Confederation Bridge shut down. Michael, we've talked about the ring road around cities. Are we ever going to get that kind of mobility back? I mean, you're going to see people wanting to make, to your point, Daniel, wanting to make the world smaller in order that they can manage it better. Any of you picking up anything like that? I mean, I know, MJ, that was a big part of the conversation early on. One set of rules for Montreal, another set of rules for outside of Montreal, and many saying people outside of Montreal shouldn't be allowed into Montreal and vice versa.
Yeah, actually at the beginning, end of March, Quebec has restricted access to 8 regions. I think we were the only province to do that, you will tell me. But by the end of March, all regions were protected from others.
Yes.
And still, they never decided to close Montreal. But it's not, you can't only think about Montreal. It's all the greater Montreal and around. So when you close everything, so people from Montreal couldn't go to Outaouais or Saguenay. Yes. But still, there's still a concern between Ottawa and Gatineau.
The bridge there, yes.
Yeah, so it's not, we are waiting for any development on this, but from what I know is there is more outbreaks in Ottawa City than in Gatineau. So that is the main point.
Rob, you got any questions there from the listeners that you want to pose to the whole panel or any individual on it?
Lots of good questions coming in, so folks feel free to hit the Q&A button and offer questions up to us. Here's a question from someone in the audience, and it goes like this. Limited store openings aside, the ban on seating in restaurants, concerts, sporting events remains a huge drag on the economy. Who might be the first premier to take the plunge on full reopening, and when might that come?
Of contingent spaces, spaces that are by definition close proximity. Anyone want to put their hand up saying that I think our region might be first?
So I'll jump in here, Alan. So, I'm only offering speculation at this point, but as I've mentioned earlier, Alberta is acutely feeling this crisis because it's also dealing with the collapse in the global price of oil. They're running a massive deficit now. Premier Kenny, that's something that he, of course, I'm sure many understand that he absolutely hates. He was elected under a mandate to balance the budget, which at one point was only about $7 billion. Now it's going to be probably over 20 billion in a single year. And I imagine that's weighing on him heavily. So it wouldn't surprise me if Premier Kenny comes out of the gates as one of the more ambitious premiers as we continue on here. So far, he's been far more muted than I expected, and he's deferred to the advice of the Chief Medical Officer of Health, and he's relied on the expert opinion to inform the reopening structure of the province. But I'm wondering at some point if he'll be tempted for rubber to hit the road, just because so many Albertans here are suffering in a unique way, and that will extend far beyond the life cycle of this virus. The last time there was a price war on the price of oil, it lasted 18 months or more. If that's the case here, then Alberta is in serious trouble. So I think the premier will eventually take any and all opportunity to get the economy going. Hopefully not at the risk of the health and safety of Albertans, and I imagine that'll be done very closely in concert with medical professionals. But I imagine he's itching to hit the button.
Let me ask you another question. We can start on shift gears a little bit and talk about testing. Again, all the epidemiologists, all the public health officials have said, look, if you don't have testing and tracing, we'll talk about tracing in a second, in place, then you're going to have a second wave and you're going to have a second shutdown. Alberta seems to be set to want to set the standard here. They're saying they're going to do 16,000 tests a day. That's a big number in a province of that size, 3 million people. And they're saying here in Calgary, anyone who wants to can get a test. What are they doing there that's different than the rest of the country?
Well, so I challenge that assertion because we're absolutely Premier Kenney has been very clear in being ambitious and leading the world in testing, and you're absolutely right. For a province of our size, about 4 million people, similar states in the U.S. are testing hundreds of people a day, where we're testing thousands. However, there is a disconnect between the amount of people we're actually testing and the amount that we'd like to get to. The Premier said he wants 20,000 tests a day. Alberta Health has said, they've increased their capacity up to 16,000. But we heard yesterday at the Daily Presser that only 4,000 people were tested. So this will be a problem, I think.
So the difference in the ambition and the capability is quite different.
Absolutely. There seems to be some disconnect there, and there will probably be questions both from opposition and the media in fleshing that out and what the problem is there. But you're absolutely right. If any economy is endeavoring to reopen in a safe manner, more information, the better. So I can certainly appreciate and understand why he wants to lead in that respect. But there is a gap between reality and what he'd like to do, even still.
That really seems to be the case, Rob, in Ontario, where the Premier has voiced much frustration about wanting to up the testing and just has not been able to hit the targets. And in fact, he's starting to kind of blame the LHIN system, that the healthcare system is very decentralized in Ontario. What's the problem there? And what impact does it have on the reopening plan?
Well, I actually wanted to glad you asked the question, because there are basically a few numbers that are important and relevant in the whole context of measuring COVID-19. One's the number of tests that you do. The next is how many people have died as a result of the disease, and then capacity in hospitals being the third. and I'm perplexed by this because it seems that in the grand scheme of things, everyone's focused on the fact that we don't have enough tests, or we don't have as many tests as we're asking for. Yet the number of deaths and the number of hospitalizations has remained at bay. So part of me wants to think that in the calculus of our leaders, not just in Ontario, but across the country, is that it's much more important to manage the latter two, the capacity of the hospitals and the number of people who are dying, than ramping up the number of tests. I think that's the third category is certainly one that is not as important in the grand scheme of things. But here's the thing: like, I think that all the provinces and all the premiers and the prime minister as well are concerned about the number of tests because everyone's talking about it. They're looking across jurisdictions, not only in Canada as is being compared, but they're looking around the world as well. And they're seeing all these tests that are taking place all over the world. And I think there's a bit of pressure that's mounts. And it's an easy statistic to say from a journalist's perspective to say, hey, your tests are low. And so the premier here has decided let's ramp that up. And he was last per capita in the country. Now he's ramped up to be, I think, in the middle of the pack, just ahead of the average. Just above the average, I should say, in number of tests per capita. So it's been ramped up, but part of me seems to think, and I'd love to hear what the other panelists have to say about this idea that we may be over exaggerating the importance of the number of tests that are deployed out there.
I think for what it's worth, from my perspective, is that we know that a significant portion of the infected population is asymptomatic, but we have no idea what size. And knowing what size will give us some sense of the real infection rate, and the real infection rate impacts on the fatality rate. So they're all linked together. And it goes to, like someone gave that great quote, we're building a plane while we're flying it, which is a terrifying way to fly. But anyway, that's either. Jody, I want to talk to you started to touch on this, but is a precondition of opening and staying open. Businesses are got very, very restrictive and detailed requirements about how much they have to sanitize the facility, what kind of spacing that they have to have, what kind of plexiglass they have to have. Are any of these requirements a huge? Well, first, what's the response of your members to having those kind of requirements imposed on them as a condition of opening and staying open? And are any of them causing your members any particular grievances?
I think one of the pieces that is causing some grief is access to it. And I mean, CFIB's we put together a Facebook page for people to access PPE, or personal protective equipment. Pardon all the acronyms, but that's the environment we live in now. Access to equipment, understanding what is required. Again, I go back to, as I mentioned earlier, that governments have to do a better job of ensuring that the guidelines that they're putting out for the different sectors are clear. They're written in plain language. Businesses understand what their occupational health and safety requirements are. The other side of this is the buy-in piece too, Alan, which I think is so important, is business owners have to understand that in order for them to conduct business effectively, they are going to have to be seen as a safe place to do business.
Of course.
As we go through different waves of this, and there will be a dance, I think they call it, with we see different levels and outbreaks here and there. There are going to be restrictions that are put on businesses. For example, let's take a company that's got 15 employees. You have a meeting on a Monday, you're back at work, you're saying, look, this is great, we're going to get out there, we're going to serve our customers. Tuesday, somebody stays home, they're sick, they've been diagnosed, the entire business is back up and running with all of these things, and then it has to shut down for 2 weeks. So the importance around making sure that these guidelines are in place and that people understand what's necessary to build trust with their clients, to build trust with their employees, which is important. We talked about getting people back off the CERB. You have to build trust with your employees that you're going to be going back to a safe workspace. And these are all very complex issues, which kind of brings me back to the operational plans and why these are so important, I think, in people understanding how they're going to be implementing these operational plans as time goes on. But it's we're talking to dentists across the country. Well, I saw what happened in Alberta. They basically said that the dentists can go back to work, and we have a situation here where the college had certain guidelines in place. They said, no, well, just get back and do what you can. Other provinces are saying that you have to deal with aerosolization because dentistry, as you know, puts a lot of stuff in the air. So you have to have ventilation, you have to have isolation. Different rules in different provinces or different guidelines in different provinces sometimes make their way into different regulations in different provinces, which become red tape, interprovincial trade barriers, and we go back into it again. So I think one of the points that I just want to end on here is there really needs to be, I think, some national standards around this so that there is people have a better understanding of what is required for them in those different sectors. And it's a role I think the federal government can play here in consultation with the provinces.
On national standards, let me go to MJ, because this is a very interesting part of the dynamic. I mean, both out of necessity and probably and constitutionally, that the federal government has to cede the management of a lot of the openings and the health management to the provinces. That healthcare delivery is a provincial jurisdiction. Yet you have this tendency on the part of the federal government to want to set national standards. We saw kind of last week, MJ, the Prime Minister saying there will be consequences for provinces that move too fast or to do things that basically I don't like. Is the management of the reopening a potential area for irritation in Canadian-Quebec relations going forward, do you think?
Yeah, the reaction of the Prime Minister was just, it was a message for Quebec, but I don't see it as a personally like a threatening message as it was reported first.
And the Premier didn't take it that way, you don't think either? And the Premier didn't take it as a threatening message?
I don't see that. Like, Premier has much more to care about now than being treated. We follow our situation, and that's true. We have like the CNNEST, I don't remember, but those this organization who build all the guides for organization for the businesses to be able to work safely. So we have already those things that are in place. I don't see this as a particular irritant. There are other matters that may come.
That there could be the source of that kind of tension. Tracing, we're running out of time here, so I'm just going to throw this to all of this. I mean, part of the reopening strategy, testing, tracing, isolation. We don't have time to get to isolation. That's a whole other issue. But tracing, contact tracing, finding out people who have come in contact with someone who's been infected, incredibly labor-intensive activity. We saw this little outbreak of new infections in Korea in nightclubs. One person infected 1,500 or had to contact 1,500 people. So a lot of people are looking at technology, apps on phones, opt-in, mandatory, what have you. Any of the provinces doing anything that's absolutely cutting edge that really is going to make a difference in terms of tracing? I throw that up to anyone who's got any kind of insight on that.
Well, I can tell you from Ontario's perspective, I think that this is one of the things where I think they're looking for federal leadership in. And because if every province comes up with 10 different ways of tracing and so on, I think it just becomes very complicated. But I will also say on the tracing front is that one of the metrics in terms of moving through the stages in Ontario is to the extent to which public health has the capacity to do contact tracing and to find people that have been in contact with individuals who had been in contact with an infected person. So, that's going to require massive investments in public health infrastructure across the province, let alone any conversations that are happening with respect to technology and deployment of technology that may assist in this process. You actually do need a human to contact these people to see if there has been any signs or symptoms of individuals that have been in contact with individuals. So I think that's another story. It's not just the technology, but it's the public health infrastructure that has to be in place in order for proper tracing regime to be.
Right now, it's just literally someone bird dogging on a telephone.
That's right.
Michael, Alberta's got an app, don't they? I was reading somewhere.
Yeah, they have the AB Trace app or some name like that, and the Premier has been plugging it as often as he can. and the chief medical officer, of course, as well. And that's the advice that they're giving all Albertans, is to voluntarily download the app. However, of course, being Alberta, there is some healthy skepticism from many in Alberta over government being able to track their movements. So the premier is actually speaking a lot to his base, the same people that support him in the last election, and having to convince them of some of these rigid compulsory health orders, and ensuring that they comply and help Albertans stay safe as a collective community. So it hasn't been easy, and I'd say Alberta is a unique case in that sense. I'm sure other provinces feel similar angst in some populations, but Alberta uniquely.
Well, we're coming out with a study next week, nationwide study of public opinion, that shows those privacy issues, especially in terms of your phone, are very, very, very real. I'm going to have the last word to you, Jordy, and then I'm going to go around to the whole group to ask them what they're looking for in the next coming months. But you've identified in your surveys, one of the things you've asked your members is, how you doing? How do you think you're going to do it? And you've identified some real vulnerabilities, sectoral vulnerabilities. Notwithstanding all the guidelines for reopenings, notwithstanding the various subsidies, I mean, are there sectors right now that you really despair for, that they just are not going to come through this in the foreseeable future with any kind of economic health whatsoever?
Again, I think it depends where you are. I know that there's just an absolute cloud that's hanging over the tourism industry here. Atlantic Canada, has a dependency on tourism, and it's a big deal. And a lot of the seasonal workers, there was a program, the RRF, that they just brought out through a COA. It's through the regional development agencies that may fill some of those gaps, but I think there's a real concern there. But generally, across the country, one of the things that we've identified among businesses, and a lot of them, 55% are worried that the new normal is not a sustainable model for their business.
What does that mean?
That's a pretty remarkable statement just in itself. That pardon me?
What does that mean? The new normal is not sustainable.
Well, I guess we can attribute it perhaps to a couple of things. And I'm hopeful in saying that this is uncertainty that is showing up in that particular question, because I don't think that they understand what this new normal is going to really mean for them. We go back to, again, the operational side of this, the complexity of it, the costs that are going to be associated with subsectors, all of those things about compliance, occupational health and safety, all of that. And then they look at it from the point of view of, if I'm a restaurant owner and I've got a restaurant with 60 seats in it, and they all have to be 6 feet apart, I now am down to 15 seats. I was already running at a 5 to 7% margin on my business. I can't do it through Skip the Dishes and Uber Eats, and it's not going to work. So the restaurant sector is another one that has a real, they've got some real challenges ahead, I think, in terms of understanding how to do business and also having some sort of an economic path forward.
To the earlier point you made about the openness of the government to at least listen to the gaps in their programs, it'll be very interesting to see if they move forward in the hospitality area and tourism. But as I say, the tyranny of time is upon us. So I want to ask again, in the next 2 or 3 months, what are you looking for? What is the measure of whether the plan is working or what it isn't working, other than an obvious second outbreak in infections? Danielle, let's start with you.
Well, yes, containment of the spread of the virus, that's the first step and the key indicator that will guide consumer confidence and ultimately economic recovery. Understanding the impacts on different sectors, short, long-term, global, local, we won't know that for a while. That information will come in the coming months, but this is unprecedented. So that information will guide, supports, but for now, keeping that curve flat is project number one, because everything else flows from that.
Michael, what are you looking for?
Well, of course, to Danielle's point, containment of the virus, of course, inspires consumer confidence. If there's a second wave and that disrupts everything, then obviously we can chalk that up to a poor performance and a poor effort to reopen. But the second obvious response is jobs. Can Alberta recover in a way that we're able to see some prosperity return to this province? I would actually quote a somebody from Alberta, Stephen Carter. Some of you may know him. He's kind of a left of center campaign strategist. And he had an interesting Twitter thread the other day where he said, facts don't win arguments. So the reason I say that is I say, can Premier Kenney convince people of a broader plan, that he is in control and has a plan to bring some recovery back to the province, especially when you have a major sector that's on the floor? Will he revisit economic diversification? Will he double down on the petroleum economy? What does he do? So there's a lot of questions and a lot at play here. And 2 to 3 months from now, on your timeline, Alan, I think it's too early to tell. So I'll be really interested to continue watching this.
Rob, what does success look like in Ontario, and what might be the stumbling blocks that would cause failure?
Can we fix the long-term healthcare crisis? I think that's where a lot of the challenges on the COVID front are going to be. And I think the other thing that I'll be looking for is the link between confidence in the economy and kids going back to schools and in daycares. I think that's something to watch for in the next few months.
MJ?
Yeah, same as Rob. The situation in long-term care house, if we do not control that in a couple of months, we will have failed. And so if it goes wrong, we will see still more cases. Montreal will continue to be closed, and we'll see more parents to keep their children at home. But for now, like construction residential construction has opened since 3 weeks and no cases have been reported. So we just cross finger and continue to obey to the safety rules.
Last word to you, Jordy. What are you looking for?
Clarity. I think that's what everybody's looking for, is an understanding of the facts going forward as best that we can get them presented to us from both the public health officials and the people who are going to be working on our economy. I know that there's a lot of talk about stimulus and whatnot, but we're going to have to understand that there aren't any, the old solutions around that we've been dealing with economically are not designed to deal with this new problem that we're facing. And I hope that the governments are going to be clear with us at all times on how they're going to be moving forward with us and the changes and what's going to be necessary for business.
Well, that's it. Time is upon us. I'm going to thank our panelists, my fellow Earnscliffians, our special guest, Jordy Morgan, and the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, who've been very supportive of what we're doing here. And we're very grateful that they've allowed you to volunteer yourself up for this, Jordy. Otherwise,
Anytime.
those who participated via the old interweb, we're going to send you out a recording of this webinar. If you have any particular questions that you didn't have answered over the course of the conversation, we will try to get back to you on those as well. And otherwise, take care and be safe.
Thanks, Alan.